On the 26th of November, 1942, an American military policeman raised a baton on an Australian soldier in the middle of Brisbane, and within 60 minutes, somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 men were tearing the city apart. By the time the sun came up, one Australian was gone, hundreds were bleeding, and the entire incident had been wiped from the record by censors on both sides of the Pacific. It stayed buried for decades. The governments wanted it that way because what happened in Brisbane that night was a city turning on an occupying force. To understand how it got there, you have to go back 11 months. On the 22nd of December, 1941, a convoy led by the USS Pensacola docked at Hamilton Wharf in Brisbane and offloaded more than 4,000 American troops. The Japanese had hit Pearl Harbor 15 days earlier. Australia was staring down a direct threat of invasion. Darwin had been bombed. Schools in Brisbane were shutting down. Families were digging slit trenches in their backyards and filling sandbags around public buildings. 200 air raid shelters went up across the city center. When the Americans stepped off those ships, Brisbane rolled out the carpet. People competed with each other to invite a Yank home for dinner. Women's magazines published recipes to make the visitors feel welcome. The local attitude toward the new arrivals in those early weeks came close to relief. That warmth curdled fast. By mid-1942, roughly 80,000 American servicemen were based in and around Brisbane, a city with a civilian population of about 330,000. General Douglas MacArthur had shifted his Southwest Pacific headquarters from Melbourne to Brisbane in July. The Americans commandeered buildings, requisitioned accommodation, and set up their own supply network that operated on entirely different rules from anything the locals lived under. While Australian civilians dealt with rationing on basics like meat, sugar, butter, tea, cigarettes, and alcohol, American personnel had access to their own post-exchange canteens. The PX on the corner of Creek and Adelaide Streets sold cigarettes, chocolate, ham, turkey, ice cream, nylon stockings, and alcohol at reduced duty-free prices. Australians couldn't set foot inside. The pay gap made everything worse. An unmarried American private earned the equivalent of $11.40 per week. An unmarried Australian private took home $3.50. When you factored in allowances and tax differences, the Americans' effective income was nearly 4 times higher. The Americans could afford to shout rounds, buy gifts, take women out, and tip generously, a custom that irritated Australian business owners and civilians who saw it as showing off. Their uniforms were sharper, better cut, and came with a spare. The diggers looked scruffy next to them, and in a city full of women whose husbands and boyfriends were fighting in New Guinea or the Middle East, the cashed-up, smooth-talking Yanks had the advantage. Divorce rates in Brisbane spiked. Newspapers complained about moral decay. The phrase that stuck was one borrowed from the British: overpaid, oversexed, and over here. The deepest cut was the way the Americans ran their military police. The Australian military had provosts, but they operated differently, lower profile, and far less prone to using force on their own side. American MPs carried batons and used them freely. They patrolled Brisbane streets with an authority that Australians, military and civilian alike, found overbearing. They hassled soldiers over leave passes, enforced curfews aggressively, and treated the city like their jurisdiction. But what Australians truly couldn't stomach was happening on their streets every day. The United States Army was segregated. Around 100,000 African American servicemen passed through Australia between 1942 and 1945, and the U.S. military command treated them as second-class soldiers from the moment they arrived. In Brisbane, black GIs were restricted to the south side of the Brisbane River. The river functioned as a color line. If a black American soldier crossed to the north side, he risked being beaten or worse by U.S. military police. In March 1942, white troops from the 208th Coast Artillery rioted for 10 consecutive nights, attacking black soldiers from the 394th Quartermaster Battalion. The Americans' own internal explanation for the violence was that white troops resented African Americans going to dance halls and associating with white Australian women. The U.S. military's solution was tighter segregation, which meant more beatings and more patrols with batons. A race riot broke out at the Waco camp. Knife fights happened regularly in South Brisbane. American MPs assaulted black troops for the simple act of being on the wrong side of the river. The Australians watched this happen, and it sat badly with them. Australia in 1942 was no paradise of racial equality. The White Australia policy was still in effect, and Queensland had some of the harshest laws in the country regarding First Nations people. But the Australian military didn't formally segregate. Indigenous Australians served in integrated units, received equal pay from 1940 onward, earned promotions on merit, and were generally treated as part of the outfit. The sight of American MPs beating black soldiers for walking down the wrong street or dragging them out of pubs for drinking alongside white Australians disgusted the diggers. Black American soldiers later said that their time in Australia was the first experience many of them had of being treated as equals by white people. That fact says as much about America as it does about Australia, but on the ground in Brisbane, it created a specific kind of friction. When the Australians saw the MPs enforcing a color bar that didn't exist in their own country, on their own soil, the resentment ran deep and it ran personal. By the second half of 1942, the tension was constant. According to military authorities, up to 20 brawls per night were breaking out between American and Australian servicemen in Brisbane alone. The arrest rate in the city climbed from 140 in June to more than 1,100 by October. Most of the early incidents were between black and white American soldiers, fueled by racism and alcohol in the rougher parts of town. But as the months ground on, the fights shifted. Australians started going after American MPs specifically. A gun battle near Inkerman left one Australian and one American soldier gone. An American MP shot an Australian soldier in Townsville. In Brisbane's Centenary Place, an American serviceman and Australian soldiers clashed in a knife fight that left one Australian gone. An American soldier was arrested for stabbing a Brisbane woman and several servicemen near Central Railway Station. 20 Australians jumped a group of U.S. submariners and shore patrol and beat them badly. This wasn't simmering tension anymore. It was a countdown. And then there was MacArthur. The Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific had made himself thoroughly disliked by the Australian military establishment. In September 1942, Australian troops under General Sidney Rowell had fought a brutal campaign on the Kokoda Track, halting the Japanese advance roughly 50 kilometers from Port Moresby under conditions that would have broken most armies. MacArthur, sitting in Brisbane, publicly questioned whether the Australians had enough fighting spirit and had Rowell relieved of command. The diggers, who'd been eating half rations in the mud, hauling wounded men through mountain jungle, while the Japanese pushed toward their homeland, heard about this, and the resentment toward MacArthur personally, and toward the Americans who served under him more broadly, became part of the atmosphere in Brisbane. The men who'd come back from Kokoda and the Middle East weren't interested in being told they lacked guts by a general who ran his war from an office building on Queen Street. And what happened next proved it. Thursday, the 26th of November 1942, was Thanksgiving Day for the Americans. Hotels in Brisbane closed at 5 in the afternoon. Military canteens stayed open until 7. Private James Stein of the U.S. 404th Signal Company had been drinking Australian XXXX beer at the Allied Canteen in Desmond Chambers on Adelaide Street. He left around closing time and started walking the 50 meters down to the American PX on the corner of Creek and Adelaide Streets. He stopped to talk with a few Australian soldiers he'd run into on the footpath. Private Anthony O'Sullivan of the U.S. 814th Military Police Company walked up and demanded to see Stein's leave pass. Stein fumbled for it. He had one, it was found on him later, but the alcohol was slowing him down. O'Sullivan lost patience, grabbed the pass, and placed Stein under arrest. The Australian standing with Stein told O'Sullivan to back off. O'Sullivan raised his baton. That was the spark. Within seconds, more Australian soldiers spilled out of the canteen and off the street to back up their mates. More MPs arrived after whistles were blown at the PX. The MPs were outnumbered immediately and retreated toward the PX building, dragging the unconscious O'Sullivan with them. Someone had put him on the ground. Stein, the man whose arrest had started it, stumbled into the PX as well. He tried to retrieve his leave pass from the knocked-out O'Sullivan, but couldn't find it. Someone handed him a baton and told him to help defend the building. Within minutes, a crowd of Australians was outside the PX, throwing bottles, rocks, sticks, and anything they could rip loose from the street. A parking sign went through a window. First Lieutenant Lester Duffin of the 814th MP Company arrived at 7:15 and found roughly 100 Australian soldiers trying to break through a makeshift cordon at the PX entrance. Police Inspector Charles Price got to the scene and couldn't do a thing. The crowd kept growing. Australian soldiers poured in from every direction. Pubs had closed, the streets were full, and word was spreading fast. The American Red Cross Club, sitting diagonally across from the PX, came under siege too. Fights erupted across the city center, block by block. The Tivoli Theater was shut down, and servicemen were ordered back to barracks. Soldiers with fixed bayonets were escorting women out of the area. By 8 o'clock, somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 people were involved. Australian MPs were spotted removing their armbands and joining the fight against the Americans. A picket sentry named Duncan Caporn stopped a small truck driven by an Australian officer. In the back were 4 Owen submachine guns, several boxes of ammunition, and hand grenades. NCOs moved through the crowd and confiscated grenades from soldiers who'd brought them. The Brisbane Fire Brigade arrived, looked at what was happening, and didn't turn on their hoses. Inside the PX, the 738th MP Battalion made a decision that changed everything. They started handing out 12-gauge Stevens pump-action shotguns. Private Norbert Grant of C Company, who'd been off-duty and had come in when he heard about the riot, took one of those shotguns and pushed his way toward the front of the building. The crowd saw the weapon. Australians immediately tried to take it off him. Grant jabbed one soldier with the barrel. Gunner Edward Sidney Webster of the 2/2nd Anti-Tank Regiment grabbed the gun by the barrel. Another soldier got Grant around the neck. In the struggle, the shotgun went off. It fired twice more. The first round hit Webster in the chest and ended his life on the spot. The second and the following rounds wounded Private Kenneth Henkel in the cheek and forearm, hit 19-year-old Private Ian Timon in the chest, struck Private Frank Corey in the thigh, wounded Sapper DeVosso in the thigh, and shattered Lance Corporal Richard Ledson's left ankle while also hitting his thigh and hand. 2 civilians were also wounded. Joseph Hanlon took a round in the leg, and 18-year-old Walter Maidment had a bullet lodged in his right leg. 8 Australians lay on the ground from a single weapon, in a single moment, fired by an American military policeman on Australian soil. Webster was 31 years old. He'd enlisted in Brisbane in 1940, joined the 2/2nd Anti-Tank Regiment as part of the 7th Division, and shipped out to the Middle East before most Americans had even heard of Pearl Harbor. His unit fought in North Africa, garrisoned Mersa Matruh in the Western Desert, and then went into Syria in June 1941 as part of the campaign against Vichy French forces. The 2/2nd saw action at Litani, Sidon, Merjayoun, Jazin, and Damour, and at Merjayoun, the regiment's gunners helped destroy 8 French tanks during a counterattack. After the armistice, the unit sat on occupation duty around Tripoli until January 1942, then shipped back to Australia as part of the mass redeployment that followed Japan's entry into the war. Webster had been a driver, a man who'd served across 2 continents in a regiment that had fought for real, and he lost his life in a street fight outside a canteen that wouldn't let Australians through the door. After the shotgun blast, there was a moment of silence. Then Grant scrambled back toward the PX, breaking the butt of his shotgun across another Australian skull as he went. American Private Joseph Hoffman, guarding the front of the PX, had his skull fractured in the chaos. By 10 o'clock, the ground floor of the American PX was wrecked, and the street had emptied out. The casualty count from the first night: 1 Australian gone from a gunshot wound, 6 more with gunshot injuries, 6 with baton injuries, and hundreds with the usual damage from a mass fistfight: broken noses, split lips, black eyes, cracked teeth, and assorted lacerations. The exact American casualty figures from that first night are harder to pin down because the U.S. military treated its own wounded internally and kept the numbers quiet. The second night was worse in some ways because it was deliberate. On the 27th, a crowd of 500 to 600 Australian servicemen gathered outside the American Red Cross building. The PX was locked down under heavy guard. Armed American MPs were positioned on the first floor of the Red Cross. In Queen Street, a group of Australians who'd taken MP batons the night before ran into 20 U.S. military policemen who formed a line and drew their handguns. An Australian officer talked the American commander into withdrawing his men before the situation turned into a shooting. The crowd then moved to the corner of Queen and Edward Streets, directly outside MacArthur's headquarters in the AMP building, and started shouting abuse at the windows. MacArthur wasn't there. He'd been in Port Moresby since early November, but his absence didn't matter. The building represented everything the Australians despised about the command structure that had insulted their mates, occupied their city, and now had an Australian man on a slab in the Brisbane General Hospital. Packs of Australians, half a dozen strong, fanned out across the city center and beat any American GI they found. American servicemen seen walking with Australian women were particularly targeted. 21 Americans were injured that second night. 11 had to be hospitalized, including 8 MPs and 4 officers. Australian provosts and Brisbane civilian police did almost nothing to intervene, and Australian junior officers either couldn't or wouldn't bring their men under control. The blackout restrictions that kept Brisbane streetlights off for air raid protection were temporarily lifted that night to prevent the violence from escalating further in total darkness. It was the only time during the war that Brisbane turned its lights back on for reasons that had nothing to do with the Japanese. By midnight on the 27th, commanders on both sides had managed to pull their people back, and then the machinery of suppression kicked into gear. The morning after the first night, Police Commissioner Carroll convened a meeting of senior American and Australian Army and naval officers, together with representatives of the State Publicity Censor's office. The chief censor in Brisbane issued a directive that was blunt and total: no cabling or broadcasting of details of tonight's Brisbane servicemen's riot. Background for censors only: 1 Australian lost his life, 6 wounded. The Brisbane Courier-Mail ran a brief, heavily sanitized piece the following day. It mentioned a disturbance at an American canteen and acknowledged injuries, but gave no nationalities, no cause, no context, and no detail. American media printed nothing. U.S. servicemen stationed in Brisbane had their outgoing mail screened, and any reference to the events was cut. Robert Bolton of the 911th Signal Company, stationed in Townsville at the time, later said that the official instruction to his unit was clear: allow no mention of it whatsoever in mail going back to the States. He believed no American newspaper ever reported the incident, and in the decades that followed, nobody he spoke to in the United States had heard of it. The censorship had the opposite of its intended effect inside Brisbane. With no official account, rumors filled the vacuum. Stories circulated that 15 Australians had been lost to machine gun fire. Other versions had American snipers on rooftops. One rumor described a trainload of wounded diggers arriving at Roma Street Station from Kokoda. At the same moment, a trainload of GIs was departing and a mass fistfight erupting on the platform. The real numbers were bad enough. 1 man gone, hundreds injured, an Allied army firing weapons at the host nation's soldiers in the host nation's capital city. But the absence of official truth let the mythology grow until the Battle of Brisbane became larger and uglier in memory than it had even been in fact. The legal aftermath was handled with the kind of symmetry that satisfied nobody. Private Norbert Grant was court-martialed for manslaughter on the 27th of February, 1943. He didn't appear in court. He'd been transferred to the Syrian campaign by then. The U.S. military found him not guilty on the grounds of self-defense. 5 Australian soldiers were convicted of assault. One received 6 months in jail. The man who pulled the trigger walked free. The men who'd thrown punches at the force that shot their mate went to prison. If the Australian public had known the full details at the time, the political consequences would have been severe. But they didn't know, because both governments made certain they wouldn't. The operational response was immediate and practical. The units involved in the disturbance were relocated out of Brisbane. MP strength was increased. The Australian canteen was closed. The American PX was moved to a different location. Rules governing leave, alcohol consumption, and movement of servicemen within the city were tightened. Senior commanders on both sides held meetings, issued directives about inter-allied cooperation, and made it clear that another incident of this scale could damage the combined war effort in the Pacific. The official line was that it had been a regrettable episode driven by alcohol and high spirits, nothing structural, nothing systemic, nothing that reflected genuine hostility between Allied forces fighting a common enemy. That was a lie, and everyone involved knew it. The Battle of Brisbane was the product of accumulated grievance that ran deeper than beer and jealousy. It was about Australian soldiers watching American military police enforce racial segregation on Australian streets and finding it intolerable. It was about men who'd fought at Tobruk and in Syria and on the Kokoda track coming home to find their city occupied by an ally that earned 4 times their pay, ate food they couldn't buy, drank in canteens they couldn't enter, and insulted their fighting record through a supreme commander who questioned their courage from behind a desk. It was about a military police force that operated with impunity in a country that wasn't theirs, using batons on locals and shotguns on allies, and then walking away without consequence while Australian soldiers went to jail for fighting back. The anger was specific, and it was earned. The incident was effectively classified for decades. Australian wartime censorship restrictions kept the details suppressed during the war itself, and afterward, neither government had any interest in reopening the file. It wasn't until Freedom of Information requests decades later that the full documentary record began to emerge. Historian Barry Ralph produced a detailed account. Robert Macklin published a book on the subject. The State Library of Queensland assembled police witness statements and military reports alongside photographs. But for most of the 20th century, the Battle of Brisbane existed only as oral history, a story passed between veterans in RSL clubs, growing wilder with each retelling because the facts had never been publicly established. What the record does show, stripped of mythology, is this. On a Thursday night in November 1942, a group of Australian soldiers stepped into a dispute that wasn't theirs to defend an American private they'd known for less than 10 minutes. They did it because an MP was pushing the man around, and they didn't think that was right. Within an hour, the entire centre of Brisbane had turned into a war zone between allies. An Australian gunner was gone from a shotgun blast to the chest, and the Australian military's own provosts were taking off their armbands to join the fight. The next night, the Australians came back and did it again, this time with planning, this time heading straight for MacArthur's headquarters. And when it was over, both governments decided the whole thing had never happened. Webster's regiment, the 2/2nd Anti-Tank, shipped out to New Guinea a month later. They landed at Oro Bay in December and went straight into the fighting around Buna. The war didn't pause for what had happened in Brisbane, and the men who'd served alongside Webster didn't get to grieve in public because the circumstances of his passing were officially unspeakable. Webster is buried in Australia, and Grant went back to active service without consequence. The PX got new windows, Brisbane went quiet again, and for the next 40 years, the only people who talked about the night an Allied army fired on Australian soldiers in an Australian city were the men who'd been standing in the street when it happened.